Dear all, on behalf of the ECIA, a big welcome to all of you joining this webinar. Today we're going to talk about auditing risk culture. My name is Willem-Jan Megens and I'm the Group Head of Audit for ING Bank. And I'm going to facilitate today's webinar together with Alexander Meemat, the Group Head of Audit for Société Générale. But before I pass on to Alexander, I'd like to make one administrative remark. Throughout today's webinar, we will be using Slido as an interactive tool with which you can respond to speakers, you can participate in the question and answer session, and also you can request a CPE certification via Slido. Simply go to slido.com and enter the code #@riskculture, and also, or you can scan the QR code on your screen now. Having said that, Alexander, maybe good to pass on to you now. Alexander, can you hear me?
Sorry, I was on mute. So, hello everyone, and thank you, Willem-Jan, for having introducing the seminar and introducing me as well. You know, I'm very proud of being there and very happy to share with you, I would say, the result of tremendous discussions that we have, you know, in our two teams, and then after into the banking committee of the ECIA on a very interesting and complex issue, which is risk culture. Audit function across the banking industry have been indeed working long and hard on how they should approach risk culture. Risk culture historically used to be seen as quite intangible, but it was an evident error, and it has been the key driver for a lot of conduct scandals and crises in the banking industry. Additionally, whilst regulators have been referencing risk culture as something key, to date, it has been lacking specificities or clear requests from them on ways to approach it. Given the existing conversations in the industry and ahead of the ECB consultation on governance and risk culture guidelines, as audit functions in ING and SocGen, we decided to come together and discuss, record our experience from establishing our risk culture audit approach. Over a period of weeks, we had several meetings and a workshop in Amsterdam to discuss what are the expectations of our stakeholders, how do we approach risk culture, can we identify some common denominators for the successful rollout of a risk culture audit approach, and what are the challenges? This conversation, which was absolutely fascinating to me, was later opened up to the ECIA Banking Committee, who also provided opinions and input. The papers that we have produced reflects the output of these discussions. Our objective with this paper is to put forward our experience to the audit community with the intention of encouraging meaningful conversation on how we, as auditors, can contribute to our organization's risk culture in a meaningful way.
Yeah, thanks, Alexander. Thanks for that introduction. It was a meaningful discussion indeed, and I very much like that as well, to have that discussion with your team. So now maybe good to introduce our two panelists of today. Maybe starting with Ségolène Kiffer. And Ségolène is Audit and Inspection Correspondent for Culture, Conduct and ESG at SocGen. So welcome, Ségolène, with us. And then also we have with us today Joanna Cicciaridi. She's the Head of Audit of Conduct and Culture at ING. Welcome, Jo. Good to see you also.
Thank you.
And both ladies are the authors of the paper, the ECIA paper on auditing risk culture that was published in July this year. So big welcome to both of you. And maybe Alexander, let's start.
Yes, thank you, Willem-Jan, and welcome, Joanna and Ségolène. So we'll start immediately with the first question. To start the discussion, would you tell us what definition of risk culture you started from when you began your discussion?
It's not an easy question, an easy task to define a risk culture, to be honest. Before we talk about risk culture, we need to talk about governance. The first message from the recent ECB consultation is a clear link between governance and risk culture, between the framework, structure, organization, procedures, controls, what we call the hard drivers, on the one hand, and the behavioral and cultural patterns on the other. Effective decision-making, group dynamics, collective mindset, what we call the soft drivers. So ECB explains that risk culture is intrinsically linked to governance and encompasses a collective mindset and the shared set of norms, attitudes, and behaviors related to the awareness management and control of risk at all levels in a bank. So it influences the day-to-day decision of staff management, of staff and management, and shapes their risk-taking behavior. So in drafting this paper, we refer to the definition in the EBA guidelines. Risk culture is no more limited to conduct or values, to what we observe in terms of incidents or breaches, and it's not static, but change over time in all parts of the organization. So the fact that risk culture is a multifaceted and evolving concept make it, of course, really complex to manage and also complex to audit.
Yeah, thanks, Ségolène. Can you perhaps summarize how this paper approaches the roles and responsibilities across the three lines of defense, including the internal audit function?
Yeah. First and foremost, it's a shared responsibility between the three lines of defense, which plays separate but interrelated roles. Risk culture is not just a matter for risk specialists, I mean second or third line. All three lines are responsible for implementing the risk culture in their day-to-day activities. So the driving force is clearly the board of directors and senior management who need to set the tone for risk culture by defining the culture through core values and a code of conduct, embodying and communicating it, and ensuring that risk culture considerations are taken into account in every decision-making process at, again, every level of the organization. So they have also to agree on standards and metrics that make adherence to culture measurable. ECB is very clear on the importance of such a measurement requirement, taking into account not only quantitative but also qualitative elements. So within the first line, manager and staff responsible for business activities are responsible for identifying, assessing, monitoring, communicating, and responding to risk as part of their operational functions. But they are also responsible for maintaining a culture of open discussion in which all employees are able to speak freely, to report mistake or misconducts, and have necessary processes in place to facilitate this. So for the second line, in the absence of hard norms and taking into account cultural differences, we can see different types of organization. And when we started writing together this paper, we had a really interesting workshop to share our respective organization in terms of risk culture. So at SD, we initially began to work on the culture and conduct topic, which is not as broad as risk culture concept. The approach consists of managing the conduct risk, especially through misconduct incidents root cause analysis, and defining and implementing the cultural transformation actions which contribute to shaping the desired patterns of behaviors and, in fine, the desired culture. So SJ chose the option to create a formalized culture and conduct related framework. However, ING has given priority to organizational psychology in order to create a safe environment to shape risk culture. So a center of excellence is responsible for defining the organization risk culture standards, metrics, and guidelines. Although the second line may not form a risk culture policy in this case, so it ensures consistent and effective risk management practices throughout the organization, ultimately contributing to the cultivation of a resilient risk culture. So we discuss the impact of our respective organization on our audit practice later. But at this stage, it could be really interesting to know what type of approach has been adopted in your institution, you who are around this virtual table. So maybe if you can answer, oh my gosh.
We're still at 22 respondents, so we still have some to go, but...
Yeah, but it seems to have a clear majority.
So rules and procedures, I think, is by far the most common selected one. So
yes. I think. Sorry.
Yeah. Does that surprise you, or?
No, not at all. Not at all. To be honest, I think we discussed that together, but I think it's the easiest way to approach at the beginning this topic.
Yeah.
So maybe to end on our third line of defense. Internal audit as a third line of defense independently assess the prevailing risk culture, its adequacy with respect to regulatory expectations, and the effectiveness of the risk culture across the organization. As there is no single solution to meet regulatory expectations, audit teams need to tailor their audit work to each organization. The essence of risk culture dedicated audit is to be able to answer the question, are the behavioral and cultural pattern observed or identified match the formally identified desired behaviors? So in short, identify the intention action gaps where the formally defined desired attitudes are not translated into actual behavior.
Thank you very much, Ségolène. You know, let me ask you a new question. You have clearly indicated us that, you know, risk culture is a moving concept. So how have standards evolved in this area of risk culture?
Yes, you told us at the beginning, this journey began with the financial crisis and the misconduct that followed, when regulator and the banking industry hardly worked to address the root cause of such events and implement reforms to prevent recurrence. So early initiatives, such as the Group of 30, focused initially on the management of conduct risk. And over time, standards have evolved to place more emphasis on risk culture, how it is managed and embedded by the organization, so that the risks are fully identified, managed, monitored. So the concept and the impact become much broader. The EBA guidance refers to a full understanding and holistic view of the risks faced and how they are managed, taking into account, of course, the institution risk appetite. And at the same time, ECB has emphasized the role of risk culture in its supervisory activity and are starting piloting risk culture deep dives to assess the robustness of risk management and governance frameworks. So the recent ECB consultation presents some good practices observed during such deep dives, as well as red flags in each dimension of risk culture. That's really interesting to prepare an audit work. In terms of approach, the current regulatory approach is not to define hard norms, but rather to provide guidelines that set expectations. So organizations are responsible for putting in place the right culture and governance to achieve this ultimate goal of adhering to their risk appetite framework.
Yeah, thanks, Egli. So no hard norms, but rather guidelines. But what finally could be considered as the fundamental elements of a strong risk culture. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, so ECB considers four main dimensions of risk culture: tone from the top, communication, accountability, and incentive. So, tone from the top, as explained before, the management body is responsible for setting and communicating the institution's core values and expectations. The behavior of its members should reflect these values. Setting an example is really key. To set the right tones, management body needs to collectively have the relevant skills and expertise, be of good repute, and be able to constructively challenge senior management. Second dimension, the communication, it includes also challenge and diversity. Sound risk culture should foster an environment of open communication and effective challenge where decision-making processes encourage constructive criticism among staff. This requires creating a diverse and inclusive workplace, ensuring psychological safety. So that there is no barrier for employees to raise concern, asking questions, or sharing opinion. And there is a real willingness to share incidents and to learn from past mistakes. Third dimension, accountability. So relevant staff at all levels should know and understand the institution core values and its risk appetite. They should be able to perform their roles and be aware that they will be held accountable for their actions in relation to the institution risk appetite and risk culture. And finally, for ECB, incentive also play a great role. There should be a link between bank's remuneration framework, its strategy, and its risk appetite. So as a good practice, the ECB mentioned that if an employee's action lead to breach of risk limits, this will have an impact on the variable remuneration. But also on the other side, that appropriate risk-taking behavior should be rewarded through financial incentive or through non-financial rewards. Maybe a last thing beyond these dimensions, it's also required to ensure an effective monitoring and follow-up of how the risk culture is embedded in the organization. It's also important to avoid a tick-the-box approach. It's really important to maintain a sound and sustainable approach, bearing in mind that risk culture, like all of us, is not static, but a continuous journey, and that have to adapt to evolving regulation and challenges.
Thank you very much, Ségolène. Let's move now to Joanna. And Joanna, welcome here. I'm very happy to see you again after our Amsterdam journey.
Really nice to see you too.
Yeah, thank you. Ségolène has just elaborated around the 4 dimensions according to which the ECB is assessing what a good risk culture is. So what are the key elements that play a role in the definition of our audit strategy for risk culture?
One of the things that became immediately clear in our workshop, right, is that whilst the optimum goal remains the same, the ways and the approach to formulating a strategy to auditing risk culture can substantially differ. And this is very much dependent upon the organizational model of the bank, as well as the cultural fabric. And think of it in the context of our two organizations, ING and SocGen. There are two very different organizations for very different reasons, various reasons. So it's not possible that we could follow the same approach. So during the workshop that we held, one key takeaway was the importance of defining clear objectives, right? And involving leadership early in that process. Both banks emphasize that focusing on the turn from the top and having consistent messaging through the organization were very important in auditing risk culture effectively. And the starting point, obviously, is open communication with senior management at the highest levels, right? And what the key points that we need to clarify in this process, right, is what senior management consider key elements, right? What elements of our risk culture strategy would help support the bank strategy, and what the senior management see as most constructive output from the audit work. And the approach cannot be one-dimensional. Multiple perspectives are needed for the formulation of an audit opinion. Our teams, through their journeys of auditing risk culture, have not been limited to one dimension. I think that's very important to say here. This is where management support is also very important. The paper that we have outlines various elements. One fundamental one is the existence of formal risk culture standards is very critical and can help audit in providing in-depth analysis. And that happens in relatively mature organizations from a risk culture management perspective. Other elements we mentioned in the paper are the existence of a policy and an approach to risk assessing, which areas are most important in examining from a risk culture perspective. So those are also elements that we covered in our workshop and mentioned in the paper. I think we also have a Slido here, right? Shall we?
So for the time being, very, very balanced. And that's a good news because, it's a clear evidence that at the end of the day, auditors consider themselves as a fully participant in the definition and in the realization of the implementation of the strategy of the bank, being fully, I would say, enabler of reasonable, I would say, development of this strategy by incorporating, what regulation says, how risk is properly assessed, and how it means the risk appetite that is, I would say, one of the backgrounds of the strategy of the bank, and also, assessing the quality and the degree of implementation or the dissemination of the policies all over the organization.
Indeed. I feel like people agree with us here as well. So perhaps I can move on because obviously we've had various challenges as well. And one of the major challenges that we've had is obviously risk culture is not it's kind of intangible in nature. It's not like auditing compliance policies or processes. And this makes raising issues particularly challenging, right? A lot of the time issues can be open to interpretation and they can be difficult to evidence, right, and be backed by clear criteria. And this can be a potential for a lot of difficulties, right, when auditing risk culture. The other element is closure of risk culture related issues can be very challenging as well, mainly because improvements take significant time to take effect. And think of it, for instance, we were talking, Segolène, about a risk assessment process. A new risk assessment process can bring long-term a lot of benefits to the organization in the way people identify and measure culture, but can also have a lot of difficulties in the rollout in the short term. So the benefits do not appear in the short term. The other challenge that we have as auditors, and is highlighted in the paper, is auditors need to be very conscious of their own culture because they are part of the organization, and they don't operate detached from it. So there needs to be that consciousness when collecting and interpreting qualitative data.
Yeah, interesting, Joanna. So how then does this paper address the topic of assessing risk culture and how to report on the findings? Because I think that's still then the dilemma, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So firstly, our paper outlines various types of data and metrics that can be used in audits, along with quantitative data. A lot of information can be collected through qualitative data, right? And that can be interviews with management, analysis of root causes, participating and witnessing discussions at governance forums. Other types of data, like employee surveys, can highlight employee sentiment when it comes to accountability or tone from the top and organizational values. And one of the other key data points that can also be used is benchmarking, right? So through the discussions that we have also ourselves as SocGen and ING, these are valuable input to try and compare our organizational culture and understand and get a little bit of a barometer of what's happening in the industry. These metrics should be used in conjunction, so qualitative and quantitative metrics should be integrated to ensure that we understand completely the picture and can align to the organizational goals. So there needs to be a balance. I think we have a slide up.
So what type of data do you gather for your risk culture assessments? See what comes in. Still interviews. Quite a lot of people highlight interviews, Joe.
Yes, that's interesting.
You didn't mention it, but yeah.
We also included a section in the paper on the types of audits that would discuss during the workshop that we have on how to cover risk culture. So along with top-down audits of the risk management framework, other types of audits highlighted were also targeted audits of formal drivers of risk culture, like incentives, or areas that are of higher risk in respect of risk culture, such as product design and sales practices. Risk culture assessments that are integrated in the standard audits that auditors do are another approach, another very useful approach to assessing risk culture. culture. And finally, a lot of organizations include behavioral risk assessments. So they have dedicated teams trying to understand the underlying behaviors. In all cases, we agreed that continuous monitoring and regularly tracking key metrics and indicators of behaviors needs to complement these approaches and have this continuous monitoring process to identify warning signs of potential issues in risk culture and conduct and address them.
I think we have another slide.
So do we have time for another slide? I
think so. Yeah.
What types of audits do you carry out the most in your respective organizations? Targeted.
Targeted, yeah. That's very interesting. Targeted is the most, I would say, critical one, and I think that it's totally in line with, I would say, a risk-based approach according to which we make our assignments. But you see also sometimes some integrated way of doing it, and top-down, which is a proof that progressively it is becoming something crucial that is assessed per se and not, as part of a targeted audit. So very, very interesting. What's your view, Joe? Because
yes,
I'm
surprised that integrated isn't a bit higher.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
You're right.
So moving on, what we did in the paper is also provide some examples of approaches and tests that can be covered based on the ECB drivers that were illustrated in the ECB guidance as well. Because risk culture isn't just about identifying risks, and it's about diving into behaviors, right, and frameworks that shape decision making. We highlighted a few examples, most notably in tone from the top and communication. So the way leadership sets the tone for risk management. And in audits, we can assess whether senior management is effectively promoting risk awareness and the right messaging. And this involves analyzing internal communications, surveys, and the flow of messages through formal channels. Another example is when it comes to accountability and ownership, there's the governance framework that's at the heart of risk culture, and we can examine the decision-making processes, the clarity of roles, the challenge, and the oversight mechanisms in respect of governance. And this ensures accountability at every level, from senior management to various teams. Obviously critical is the use of data and metrics, like I mentioned previously. It's not about having a gut feeling, but data drives the story. So metrics and data are critical in identifying trends and monitoring ongoing risk behaviors. And by assessing these, we can try and measure our risk culture and track it. Incorporating all of these factors in our audits helps us identify any gaps and shape a sustainable, accountable, and risk-aware environment within organizations. And on the last point with regards to reporting, we agreed that there's no single way of approaching the reporting. So some key elements that are highlighted in the paper is that both organizations find communicating risk culture observations quite challenging, so that in a way that doesn't appear also inflammatory. And commentary in the reporting can do that sometimes and appear sometimes open to interpretation. And both organizations follow a different approach when it comes to disclosing risk culture ratings. In all cases, we agreed that the board and senior management should have the discussion, right? And the approach should be chosen with the senior management, and how we report risk culture findings.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have another slide on here as well.
Yes.
Let's look at that. And this is basically whether you opt for assigning a risk culture ratings, right? And that is next to the control environment. You also have a separate rating for risk culture. The majority don't, actually.
It was one of the important questions that we discussed.
Yes.
Frank, we have not the same approach. You don't, we do.
Yeah.
And it was very interesting to have this discussion, and in particular to understand first that when you quote, and the way you quote a risk culture may have an impact on the risk culture itself. And that was very interesting to hear this from you. And second, also that for the audit teams, it's probably much more difficult to quote risk culture and to convince the auditees that the quotation is accurate than, I would say, globally auditing the findings of a report. And that was also very interesting in the discussion we had together.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And again, there's no right or wrong. It's just a different approach and how you go about it. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for that. Well, that brings actually us to the Q&A part of today's webinar. You can actually post your questions via the Slido if you have any, and we will then take them up with our panelists. Maybe I can start with the first question, maybe for you, Ségolène, while all the questions do come in. For an internal audit function that is starting assessing risk culture, what would be your recommendation? Where do you start, actually?
It's not easy as we told. It depends on the organization and the maturity of the bank in this area. But a first approach could be to review the governance, the risk appetite framework, to identify the desired culture, and then to assess the level of effectiveness of the 4 dimensions of risk culture and the potential gaps with respect to desired culture. The latest ECB guidelines can clearly be used as a tool to prepare a first audit.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's move to the second question, which is a very also interesting one. The paper talks about a strong risk culture as a good thing, but even a bad culture, a bad risk culture can be very strong. So how will you address that?
Who's going to answer the question?
That's indeed a very difficult question. The traditional way to do it, I would say, is to observe the conduct issues that a bad or bad risk culture, I would say, makes possible and and has in the past, developed, or but it's not enough, and this is exactly the discussion that we had together. Risk culture is probably part of wrong, I would say, conduct or risk management globally, but it's not enough. It's also a question of governance processes, product management, client relationship, and that's why it's so difficult, to identify as the unique root cause of a bad or a strong bad risk management, I would say.
Yeah, if I may add, Alexander, I think what is very important is that right from the top, and we talked about the top from the top and how important that is, that we define what maybe I avoid the word strong, but a good risk culture is, and what it is about, and what we expect from all our employees actually in a good risk culture. And once you have that, you have actually things how you could address it in your audit approach. But the moment that is not defined, I think it's very difficult for auditors to start challenging whether something is good or bad. I think if it's not defined, I would start at that level at the board that should be defined. I'm not sure, Ségolène or Joe, whether you have thoughts about it, but that will be my response, please.
I agree, and I would probably say because the expression strong risk culture is used in the paper, I think the context of strong is means exactly that, that it's aligned to the values of the organization, that it fulfills the bank's strategy, that it helps cultivate the behaviors that the bank needs for its success. So I think I very much agree with the positioning that strong cannot always be good, but I think in the context of the paper, that what we mean is that kind of type of culture.
But it's true that then after the issue is that, most of the time, people are not totally aware that they've got a bad risk culture. So it means that tone from the top is definitely necessary, but it's not enough. It's also a question of training, speaking with people, developing their awareness. It's a question of incentive as well. How do we encourage, I would say, a good risk culture? And so how do we, I would say, condemn, I would say, or sanction, I would say, a bad risk culture as well.
Yeah.
And I think that it's, tone from the top and definition of what a good culture is probably the first thing to do, or the background. But then after, there is a lot to be done, to train people, to accompany the change toward a better risk culture.
Yeah. Shall we move to the next question? Maybe Ségolène, maybe you can respond to that. So, who else in your organization is assessing risk culture? Do you collaborate with them?
Yes, on the SG side, risk culture is also assessed by the second line of defense, compliance, through controls, and by human resources, HR, in particular through employee surveys. And both are working with first line and operational risk teams on incident root cause analysis. And we have regular discussion with all those teams, to share and challenge their results and their views on the evolution of the risk culture within the bank.
Yeah.
Maybe Johanna, you want to add something?
Yeah, because it's interesting, because I know the setup in the organization is a bit different. So maybe it's good to also look at how ING is doing it. Yeah.
Yes, of course. I mean, in ING, we have a Risk Culture Center of Excellence, which conducts the behavioral risk assessments and conducts also in-depth analysis and gains insights on the organization's risk culture. And simultaneously, they actively assist the first line in understanding their cultural dynamics and develop action plans for improvement. So they assist the organization in the improvement on an ongoing basis.
Okay, so let's move to the next question. So, what is your experience in terms of board oversight on this topic? And what are they looking for in terms of information?
So in my experience, the board is particularly attentive to oversight of risk culture, and they seek a comprehensive understanding of drivers affecting their current weaknesses and issues that they see. So they're very interested in identifying those behaviors that drive their vulnerabilities and to determine corrective actions. So to support this, they a lot of the time they ask for broad narratives, high-level themes on cultural indicators, but also they ask us to provide recommendations and actions they can take as board to improve their organization risk culture.
Thank you, Joe. Maybe move to the question, the following question. Where are the key changes in the updated EBA guidelines on internal governance and risk culture compared to the previous version? That's maybe someone who hasn't read the new guidelines yet, but I don't know, Joe, you wanna comment on that?
I can comment. If you say what are the changes, there's no changes. I think what the ECB is trying to do is very clearly outline and summarize previous expectations that they had included in various guidelines and papers. So they've collected all that, particularly when it comes to governance, in one paper. As for the risk culture, I think they are more explicit on potential ways an organization can manage its risk culture. I think the risk culture red flags are particularly interesting, and those are not, I wouldn't say new, but more explicit references to elements that can potentially be taken into account. So I think that's how I see the new guidelines. I think they mean the ECB guidelines, not the EBA.
Yeah, you're right. And you know what is very interesting in the current consultations that we've got with them is that, you know, they tell us, you know, very regularly that it is not, that this has not, I would say, obligations, but guidelines, you know, based on best practices that they have seen all over the industry during the past, I would say, years of supervision. You know, the interesting questions that we have is that, you know, will this remain best practices, or will this become progressively obligations? And, you know, if it becomes obligations, you know, linked with what you said, Joanna, when risk culture becomes an obligation, you know, the obligation are contributing in changing the risk culture itself. And so it is probably a challenge.
Yeah. Shall we go to the next one? Is it a better strategy to start auditing risk culture as an advisory engagement rather than an audit one, given the many soft attributes this area has? Ségolène, what do you think? Oh, you're on mute, Ségolène. You need to unmute as well. Ségolène, you're on mute. Sorry. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, you need to start over.
I'm not sure. For us at SocGen, I don't think it's a choice. I think we need to audit risk culture, but I think it also depends on the organization. And with an organization like yours, more based on a psychological approach, an advisory engagement is maybe preferred. I don't know, but I think it really depends on the structure of your organization. I don't know if you share my position, but.
Joe, what do you think?
I think I share your position. I think for sure, where there's very soft elements assessed, a more soft approach might be advisable, right? And where you have certain governance policies, procedures that you need to also assess that contribute to your risk culture, maybe those can also be considered as more strictly audited. So I think it also depends on the types of engagement and work, but also, like we said, the communication with senior management and how they see the benefit from the engagement work.
Yeah. I hope that addresses the question. Yeah. Shall I continue, or you want to do it, Alexander?
Yes, if you want, So the next question is from Mr. or Mrs. Patterson. How do you make our risk culture be aligned with the IIA standards? I mean, in terms of coordination, criteria, consequences. Joanna or Ségolène?
I think Joanna will be better than me on this issue, to be honest.
I think it's a tough one, right? To be honest, because I think that's the part that we are all struggling with a little bit, because I think this is the part that Jo also explains in the introduction. It's very difficult to define a remedial action for a certain behavior or for certain culture aspects. But maybe Jo, what you could say how we are addressing it in ING.
Definitely with the IA standards, there is an alignment because obviously there is guidance in the IA standards about how you're supposed to understand the underlying drivers of your issues and the behaviors, right? So I think definitely there is an alignment, and we can potentially we're not forced into a route of how we approach this topic necessarily. And I think where we have to be very clear is the agreement of the standards, the metrics, and how we take that forward. And of course, there is a requirement for a little bit out of the box thinking, but also always aligning with the standards. I don't know if I answered the question, but I think
yeah.
So can you provide examples of risk culture, I would say, rating in a more illustrative way? So this is probably a question that I can take insofar as this is something that we are trying to implement. We are still in a testing mode, to be frank. So we'll see whether it works or not. But I will give you how we intend to proceed. So this will not be a risk culture rating, but more a risk awareness rating. And what we try to assess through these ratings that will be, I would say, proposed at the end of each and every audit assignment within Société Générale is based on, answers by the auditors on a number of questions. I would say, illustrating, the level of risk awareness of the managers of the entities that we are auditing. The first one is that is the risk appetite of the entity coherent with the strategy, the development strategy of the entity, and is this risk appetite, I would say, clearly controlled and ensured on the ground? This is the first question. The second one is that is the manager totally aware of the new risk coming from its activity, and did he put in place the appropriate, I would say, controls or I would say measures to mitigate properly this risk and stay in its risk appetite. Third issue, how does this risk awareness, how is this disseminated into the organization? So through surveys, through interviews with the teams, we try to understand, how deep this risk awareness is disseminated in the team and how it is influencing the decision-making process, the behaviors, the relationship of the different members of the team with their stakeholders and ultimately with their clients. We also try to take the tone from the top, the training capabilities, and the incentive/sanctions, coming from bad risk awareness or bad risk culture. So this is what we are trying to do. So to be very clear, we are in in the phase of testing, I would say, this new methodology on the basis of around 50 assignments that we are currently finalizing these days. And on this basis, we will review it a little bit to then after try to generalize it, next year. But you're right by saying that it's not such an easy exercise. We took a lot of time designing these different questions, and we will assess with a lot of attention, the ways the auditors have responded to them, and with which type of, I would say, audit trails, proofs, or tools that they have used to properly respond to these different questions.
Yeah, thanks, Alexander. Maybe looking at the time, maybe we can do one more final question and then we wrap up. So last question is, what type of quantitative data do you consider more relevant to assess risk culture? Joe, any thoughts there?
Yeah.
So there's various data that can be used, but if used in isolation by themselves, they can be misinterpreted. So I want to clarify that if I say a few data, it doesn't mean that it points to one direction or another just by itself, right? So you could have data on limit breaches, or you could have operational risk incidents, or you could have data on whether there's how many lessons learned are carried out, or metrics regarding audit findings, right? There's a lot of discussion how audit findings and the number of audit findings versus self-identified issues can show something about the risk culture, but they can't be interpreted in isolation. You need to use them in conjunction with other information, qualitative information and surveys to understand it.
Yeah, Sibylle, you agree, or you have something to add to that? Oh, you're on mute again, Sibylle. Yeah.
Sorry, excuse me. No, I have the same answer, and I think that Alexander also answered to the various indicators which can be taken into account. So I think that's fine.
Yeah. Okay.
In fact, beyond pure incidents or the way finding recommendations are mitigated, there is another range of data that we are currently use, which is the result of the staff barometer.
Yeah.
In the staff barometer, we are asking different questions about capacity of the staff to speak up. The ways they see the ethical, behaviors of their managers and of the bank as a whole. The diversity also of the team, which is, according to me, an indicator of the risk culture, because the more diverse the people are, the better they understand the risk they carry on their different activities, and the better they find out the good solutions to mitigate them. So these are all other, of course, quantitative data that we used in assessing risk culture, but it's true that, we don't have to see them one by one, but it's only, through a sort of comprehensive assessment of both quantitative and qualitative, I would say, data that you are able to approach how the risk culture is.
Yeah. Thanks, Alexander. Yeah, maybe to bring it to a close, I think this discussion really revealed that auditing risk culture is a dynamic journey, and that must be understood in the unique context of each organization. But it's not just a dynamic journey for the organization; it's also a dynamic journey for audit teams themselves. And not everyone has the same understanding or the perception of risk culture. And therefore, it's essential that we start this journey from a shared starting point and continuously evolve, adapting our approach as the organization, the regulatory standards, and also the audit function themselves evolve over time. And I guess senior management in the banking organizations, but I guess also the regulators, they must recognize that auditing risk culture is a continuously evolving process, and they should remain open to experimenting with it, with new approaches, and understand that innovation often comes with setbacks as well. And embracing this mindset also allows for continuous improvement in this area and in adapting and managing risk culture effectively. I think that's what I want to say as a closure. You can all download the ECIA paper on auditing risk culture. I think it's a good read, so I really encourage you all to download it from the website of the ECIA. I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. I hope you find it insightful. Thank you, Ségolène. Thank you, Joanna. And also thank you, Alexander, for being here today. And all of you joining today's webinar. Have a good day and speak to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.